Welcome, everyone. It is such a cool opportunity to have a global speaker series where we have people bringing in new insights and sharing with us their perspective, their experience, their just a world vision that sometimes it's not necessarily that it has to contrast with ours or conflict with ours, but ideally it adds to our view of the world. And in my world, not only do I teach, but I travel a great deal and I speak and I collaborate with people. But one of the things I do, and I'm really happy to do, and I'm really happy this is part of my experience is networking. And one of the people who happens to be our speaker today, who I'm very fortunate to have met along the way, is Dr. Morrine Omolo. She is a research scientist in the area of food safety. She's a Ph.D. scientist at University of Minnesota. And we had some conversations a while back, and as we got to talking more and more, I realized we need to bring her perspective on to this platform and allow her to share some of her insights. We'll get some takeaways and have opportunity for some Q&A from the students. If you are watching this, I am recording because there are many students that won't be able to watch us live. And so a recording of this will be made available within the course. But let's go ahead and welcome Dr. Morrine Omolo. Welcome. Oh, there you go.
Thank you, Dr. D. It's a pleasure to be joining you this evening. I'm based in Minneapolis. I've been here for about 7 years now at the University of Minnesota. Thank you for the warm welcome. It's a pleasure to meet your students. And of course, I'll be curious to hear your thoughts, your experiences, and what lends to your interest in this space of global work. I'll let you share the questions that you have for me and how I can best
Sure.
lend my expertise to your students.
Well, first off, the students who would, I'm sure one of the first questions is, what is your role? What exactly do you do? Because I have to admit, I talk about networking. I can meet 5 people with the same title and they all do different things. Conversely, I can meet 5 people with different titles and they all do the same thing. So elaborate on what do you really do?
Well, you are right, and especially in the field of food science. Food science is one of those fields that's really unknown to most people. When people hear food science, they think about cooking and kitchen and KitchenAid. That's what comes to their mind. But in the very broad category of food science, which goes all the way from what happens to food immediately leaves the farm to when you find it in the supermarket, I'm in that small pocket of invisible people called food safety scientists. We are the ones that work in the back. And our hope is that you never hear about us, because if you're hearing about us, something went wrong with your food. So I'm a food safety specialist. I work primarily with small-scale food producers and medium-sized processors. So what that means is we have a whole area called local food movement, local food systems, and many people now want to know, where does my food come from? But in addition to wanting, of course, to know food producers and talk to them and understand how they're contributing to topics like climate change and sustainability, everybody wants safe food. So my role in that space is understanding how local food systems are different from corporate manufacturing, and how the science that has inherently been and has stayed in the corporate space, how can it trickle down and inform the small-scale producers to also make sure that whatever they're bringing on to farmers markets or your local bodega or whatever it is you get your local food from, that it still is safe. So really bringing the science so that it meets the people where they're at in food production. That's the simplest way to summarize my current role.
Well, and many people are curious as to, wait a minute, so you do this, but you actually work for a university. A lot of people don't realize that there's these land-grant universities and other major universities that have significant agricultural programs. There may be, universities that have significant dairy programs or cattle programs or different specialties based on where they are. Is that the kind of situation you're in which there's kind of like a academic and industry partnership with the work that you do?
So I'm based in the College of Food, Ag, and Natural Resources. So we are everything food production. And the University of Minnesota is a land grant institution, which means by law, we are expected to move the science beyond our laboratory setting into the community. So the people around the world need to benefit in some capacity from the work that we say we are doing, right? So my role is that hybrid. I'm in between the lab coat and the actual implementation of that science in the community. So being able to understand the science, but also learning human behavior and how people communicate, so science communication, and being able to once in a while put on my jeans and sneakers and go out to the field and meet producers and talk to them the science in a way that makes sense so that they can actually apply it. That component of the work at the university primarily falls under the umbrella of extension services. That's what we call that area. But you don't have to be an extension employee to work in this space. It just happens to be the biggest body that governs that work.
Excellent. I've been to many different land grant universities with these types of programs, and it's always amazing when there's these massive buildings and massive labs and equipments and rooms, and it's like this room is it's like it's sponsored by this company and this equipment is sponsored by that company, and you start going into it thinking like, wait, is there a conflict of interest here? But you realize that this is what a true partnership looks like, and the idea of it's not just the university name on things, it's industry name on what you're doing as well. How did you get to this point in your career? I mean, obviously you weren't a little girl and you were doing this work in home. You had to, yet your journey involved a lot of steps, I would imagine.
It did, and I always enjoy telling my story, especially to other little girls in my community back home. So I was born in a small village in Kenya, and that is in East Africa. And I remember wanting to be a neurosurgeon my whole life. And at some point, my mom just got so sick of hearing it that she started buying me books from Ben Carson and other scientists to learn and study and understand how to become a scientist. And over time, my father and my mother kind of ended up in jobs where my mom was a home economist and my dad was a farm manager. So basically the person in charge of the research area that has animals when you're doing research and understanding beef animals, grazing animals, milk animals, that whole combination of what you need to have sustainable systems in agriculture. He was in charge of that. So my life was spent around an environment just like my research institution, where I would run around and I would see research scientists and plantations and greenhouses. And so these were things that were embedded at the back of my mind, but never really played an immediate role in my dream as wanting to be a doctor. It wasn't until after high school, I just happened to meet somebody who mentioned this organization that really focused on girls who already had shown potential for leadership, interest in wanting to learn abroad, but also had the grades to support it. So it's not just a matter of hanging around and dreaming about going to America, but really showing the potential to do that, to be independent, to come in a foreign country when you're so young. So my mom basically put me on a plane, one suitcase, $100 in my pocket, and hoped that the scholarship that I had applied for was real. And I ended up in Jersey.
Wait, how old were you?
I was 17, turning 18 when I came.
Wow.
So I ended up in Jersey, picked up by a host. We spent the night at her house. The next morning, she took us to Target. We bought some T-shirts and sandals, and she dropped us off at campus. And that was that. That's how I started my life in the US. Extremely steep learning curve for how education works in this country, how it's different, the hierarchies. And I came from a community where girls are supposed to be conservative and quiet, sit down, cross your legs, don't shout your voice, don't be dramatic. when men are speaking, wait your turn, and definitely no children speaking when adults are speaking. It's very systematic, very organized way of communication. And I know a lot of people outside of that culture feel like it's dominance, but it really isn't. It's just our way of life and showing respect for our parents. So after this 4-year period, really, I was focused on going to medical school. So all my internships were in hospital settings, OR settings, watching spinal fusions and brain surgery, 6-hour surgeries. And then I got to the end of my 4 years and had a major identity crisis, because I realized that I would not be able to afford the loan that I would need to go to medical school. I did not have anyone that would be willing to co-sign that kind of money for a foreigner. But I also didn't have a plan B. So I just took a year off, worked as a lab technician. That relocated me from Jersey to Minnesota. And then I spent the next year just figuring out, I'm trained in biological sciences. I have a history in food production. What can I do with that? And I just stumbled upon food science. I really was deciding between public health and biomedical engineering. And as I looked through catalogs over a year, I discovered food science, applied, got into 2 programs here at the U and in Alberta. I chose to stay. I didn't want to start over again. So that long-winded story got me into food science, and the experiences narrowed it down to food safety, and transitioned from the master's to the PhD, both funded. And now, after my PhD, graduated in the middle of COVID crisis, and Extension decided to hire me. They were just happy with the work that I had done with the dissertation. So that got me here. That's the short version.
Well, your career objectives changed.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I have been talking about how you're looking at making a leap from working at the university and going out and working perhaps for a company, or maybe a state government or some other entity outside of the academic setting. And what's amazing is that even with your degree and your experience, there's still a lot of different directions that your career can take you. And here you're looking at this journey ahead, but I want to go back to this journey, getting to the United States. I have to admit, if I was 17 or 18 and being dropped off in New Jersey or Minnesota, I would have a level of apprehension, nowhere near, I'm sure, the level of apprehension and that you were getting yourself into. What was going through your mind as you're starting afresh? That you said you got some t-shirts and some sandals, and all of a sudden you're a college student, and you had to be going through some major identity searching and developing there as well.
Yes, a lot. And depending on what time of the first 3 months we are talking about, the first week was really problematic with communication. It's amazing that I grew up in a fully functioning English-speaking country. We were colonized by the British, so we speak the British English. And the minute I landed in the US, I knew I was in trouble because nobody understood anything I said. And it wasn't that I was saying it wrong, it was just I was enunciating it different. And so I walked with a notepad and a pen for the first week. Just I would say something, and if I had to repeat it twice, I would write it. Some of the words didn't exist, like you say the trunk of your car, we say boot of your car, right? Simple things like that. So then the first 1 week was really about situating myself mentally and realizing all of a sudden that everybody around me looked so different. Not just skin color, but I mean the way they dressed, the way they carried themselves, the way they related to one another. College in America is very free. People relate to each other in a very free, cordial way. I thought my mother would be really upset if she saw me relate that way to people of the opposite sex, but that was just normal, and I had to get used and be comfortable with that. Nobody was trying to be unfair or disrespectful. It was just the culture. But the next 3 months after that was really about realizing that I suddenly went from being the child of a farm manager and a home economics teacher and a Kenyan girl to being a Black woman in STEM. Suddenly I had to wear that banner, and I had to think about when I was in Kenya preparing to come to the US, it was about potential, right? I was being given a full scholarship based on potential. Now it was really about living up to that potential because my scholarship was based on my performance. I had to maintain 3.5 or better GPA, continue to show leadership, continue to show interest in global perspectives. These were things that suddenly went from being potential to being burdens of performance. And it happened very quickly. So that transition where my identity completely changed from just being a young girl in Kenya aspiring to study in America to suddenly being, she's in America and now she's the role model for all of us that are left behind in the village. It suddenly became this weight on my shoulder. And it's been that way ever since. It's just really managing what that really means from time to time.
I have a couple questions, but I want to go ahead and open it up to the audience. If any of the students have any questions, not that you have to, but if you have any questions, I know you can raise your hand or you can just unmute and ask. Does anyone have any questions before we move on?
I guess I have a question.
Sure.
I was just.
I can't wait. Well, first off, who is this? I don't know who this is.
Beth.
Oh, hello, Beth.
Osterlin? How you doing?
Good. I just couldn't see who was speaking. Sorry.
No problem. Can you hear me now, though?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I just was wondering, just on the same thread that you just were talking about, going from a young girl in Kenya to a college student in the United States, you also probably went from being part of the majority to being a minority in the United States. And, I've sort of read about different things about international students coming here and having that experience. And I just wondered if you ever felt that or what that transition was like for you.
Thanks, Beth, for your question. Yes, that was the first reality, and that happened at the airport, actually, the realization that I was suddenly the minority, just coming out of the plane, because when you're coming from Africa and you transition through Europe, that transition doesn't really help you see what's coming. It's when you step out of the airport that you suddenly realize it's a sea of people that look extremely different from the way that I looked. Initially, the difference was about skin color. So just realizing that I'm Black and I was trying to, in many ways, find the other Black people in the crowd to make me feel safe and seen. And so that's what I did initially, just mentally. I couldn't help but find where are the other Black folks in the crowd. And the minute I started to see them, I started to feel, okay, there are other people that look like me. They're just not as many. But then it became a reality that over time, I started to differentiate not by skin color, but by interest in studying, interest in research experiences, interest in hobbies and how to spend my time outside of class, and interest in studying. So over time, the fact that I was Kenyan and Black and a woman became less important, and the things that were about potential and success and keeping up that expectation became more important. So I started to push myself towards groups of individuals, and it turned out to be an amazing combination of people. And one of them was from Nigeria. Everybody else was from another country that was not on the African continent. So that happened by the end of the first semester, I was beyond my skin color and my nationality to goals and what was important to my keeping my scholarship. And that put me in a very different, very diverse group of people. In terms of being a Black woman in STEM, when we talk about minority in that sense, that was not something I had before I came here. That was an identity I picked up by the label that was put on me. the university and by organizations and by censors and by all of these surveys that go around. I had to start identifying as that on documents. But in my mind, I've never thought of myself as a Black woman in STEM. I've always just thought of myself as a food scientist.
Great question.
Thank you for that. It sounded like you assimilated pretty quickly. And just one more follow-up, and then I'll put myself on mute. But just, you were at a university. Some of us work at universities. Did the university help you in this way, assimilate, or did you feel like the university was supportive, or are there areas where they could have done a better job?
I went to Fairleigh Dickinson University in Teaneck, New Jersey, and the reason why I was able to assimilate so quickly is because of the university I went to. They have a very active international student population, and the staff took extreme pride in helping students settle in and acclimatize. And because I was a fully funded international student, it was in their best interest to help me settle down quickly and understand what's going on, because their reputation was also on the line. I basically came under the banner that they picked me out of 200 potential applicants, and they said, this is the student we want, and we are going to help her succeed. So in many ways, I am extremely grateful for the university staff for going above and beyond what I think would have been the bare minimum just for me to be a student. And for the university itself, for having such a broad student population, that made it easier for me to fit in, because there was a space to fit. Initially as a foreigner, but later as a student, there was an identity for me to pick up because they already had a space for it.
Wow, that's very great that your university was that supportive. I would imagine that there are some others out there that would not have been as supportive as that. And how would you know until you're in that position, I guess, huh? Great.
I still have connections with that university up to. I still speak to individual, the provosts, the dean of, students. I still keep in touch with them even today.
Great. Any other questions from our audience before we move on? Well, I would like to transition now. We've been focusing on this idea of the journey to the United States, but one of the things in your not too distant past here is you traveled in a grant-funded project back to Kenya. And this took, from what you were telling me, this took a little bit of adjustment as well. Can you tell what was the situation you were in, and what did you experience?
It did. So halfway through so this is in 2017, I was 2 years into my PhD, and as you'll see as a recurring theme with me, is networking is extremely critical. For me, it is, and for being in an international space, you need people who are not just mentors, but people who can actually support you and put their name on the line to support you. So I spend a lot of time networking deliberately with people, building relationships, not just calling people when I'm in trouble and expecting them to somehow, stop what they're doing to help. So because of that lifelong relationship building, I was already in collaboration with and constantly offering to help our director of global initiatives in Extension. So in 2017, he had this project funded by USDA. They were going to Kenya to work with 200 women, teaching them post-harvest technologies to preserve vegetables, local vegetables. And he reached out to me and said, we are willing to have a food scientist on the ground, fully funded in Kenya for 3 weeks. We could not think of a better person, not just because you're Kenyan, but because of your interest in food safety in general. So that's how I ended up on the ground. And as we were talking, I mentioned that going back is something I had not thought about in the capacity of the scientist. I've always gone back to visit as the daughter of Africa, the daughter of Kenya. And that was easy. I just went to my mom's house and became her daughter for 3 weeks or whatever, But now I had to go back, and they had all these rules from the university. If you're traveling as a university employee, you have to follow these rules. You can't take the local transportation. You can't be in these places. You can't do that. And I kept thinking, this is going to be ridiculous because I want to go home and see my mom. But the most critical part about that trip was this moment of realization. How am I going to achieve the goal of teaching women who are my mother's age the concept of food safety and food preservation as a scientist? And I realized very quickly after I went back home, just having those initial conversations and planning and scheduling, that I was going to have to shed off that lab coat. I was going to have to put PhD aside, and I was going to have to be their daughter for the duration of that training period. So I had to find a way to balance my reputation as a scientist and a university employee, but have the humility to basically cloak myself back into what a typical African woman is in relation to women who were my mom's age. And it turned out to be fascinating because I was teaching them in Swahili, which I have not had formal Swahili conversation in a teaching capacity since I left home. So I had to remind myself official words for things in a teaching environment. And they found it hilarious. They laughed, they helped me. We did, I taught the classes a picture setup. Instead of using too many words, I put up pictures and I would ask them, what's wrong with the picture? How can you make it better? What would you do differently? It turned out that appreciating and acknowledging what they already knew, what they were already doing, and then building on science to help them improve that, it turned out to be a very effective teaching methodology, as opposed to coming in with my PhD lab coat telling them, you know, this is how you should do it. This is microbiology, you should listen to this. So I really enjoyed that trip. And so it taught me something about humility, even with the accolades and the letter words after our names, you know, and they keep coming, you know, start with BS, MS, PhD, and then you get all these certifications. Yes, it's amazing to have credentials, but if you're going to work with a community, you have to meet them where they're at. And in this case, I had to remember who I am in this community. It worked out just fine. I was okay. In the end, I was fine.
I have to admit, I'm thinking in terms of like masks, right? A label, whether it's a lab coat or a definition, a woman of color in STEM, you know, we wear different masks, and it's one of these very tangible and real examples of where to wear the mask that you're expected it in this capacity works, but all of a sudden you transition it into this capacity and it no longer carries the meaning or the influence or the ability to bridge that, and vice versa. And so you were there with a group of other people from the university. They're seeing you essentially, you know, take off this identity that they know you. And what was that experience? Do you have a sense of what the experience was for them in terms of seeing you physically adjust yourself to be able to bridge that audience?
I think in the beginning, they weren't quite sure where I was going with it, because this wasn't just about switching to Swahili. It was about changing my dress code as well, right? So in the African traditional setting, I should be wearing a decent skirt, not too tight. You know, the less skin you show, the better. And here over the summer, you know how students dress. And I've seen some of my professors dress kind of like that too, sometimes in the summer. So it was, in the beginning, they weren't quite sure. It was more of a, we'll watch and see where that's going. But as they saw the response from the mothers, and they saw how the learning experience played out, and they realized that we achieved the goal, and that moment of debriefing where they noticed that if we had gone the expected route of me in my PhD capacity, we would have lost these women. It was a moment of appreciation for, it was a learning, a teachable moment for all of us, because I did this on the fly. It wasn't something I had planned 6 months in advance. It was a moment of us realizing, first, the value of bringing somebody who can fit into the culture so that they're seeing themselves in me, they're seeing their daughters in me. I wasn't some, American trying to transplant their ideas onto Kenyans. And at the end of the training, 2 of the women actually raised their hands and they said, whatever it is you're learning in America, go learn more of it and then come and teach us. That was how the training ended. And I was happy that it turned out well, that it did not backfire on me. Yeah, so the report was okay. I did not have to explain myself too much going that route.
And did you get to see your mom?
So yeah.
And did you get to see your mom?
I did. I was given 3 days off and I was able to go see my mom, but the rules stayed. I could not take public transportation like the motorbikes or the local minibuses. I had to take a taxi. They paid for it though, but I had to continue in until I was handed over to my mom. I was in my capacity as a university employee. So yeah, it worked out fine.
Wow. You and I were also talking about how you traveled to Japan, not in the same kind of a situation, but that was also a big eye opener for you in terms of so what were you doing in Japan, and what was the big takeaway you had from that experience?
So the Japan trip was completely different. It happened in the same path that the Kenyan trip went. So through my collaborations and networking and interactions, had been exposed to a biotechnology research institute here on campus. And my then PI was a member of the Biotechnology Research Institute. And every year they have this exchange program with the Nara Institute of Technology in Japan. So every year they send out a call for proposal for exchange students. So 3 of their students come to us and 3 of ours go to them. So they make it we'll go and then we'll come back with 3 of their students or the other way, whatever works easiest. I happened to apply because I spoke to my advisor and said, I think I was building genome scale metabolic models. What that means is simply I was trying to capture the entire gene pool of E. coli on the computer, 0s and 1s, and trying to understand why or what is it about the E. coli genome that makes it so flexible. It can live in our guts, it can live on beef, sometimes it contaminates fresh produce. So what is it about it that is so diverse and so flexible? And how can we take advantage of that diversity to target and eliminate it when it's a pathogen? And Japan, Nara is the only place in the world that has this gene knockout collection where they eliminate just 1 gene for every E. coli. So you can screen the entire gene pool using a robot in a very, very quick, easy screening. You just set it up and the robot does the test for you. So that's how I ended up in Japan on this. Again, it was a fully funded research project. I was there for a month. The Japanese culture is nothing I have experienced before. It is similar to the Kenyan culture in terms of humility and making yourself small in spaces, which is different. The US culture is about occupying space and speaking your voice, speaking your mind, always airing your opinion. They're very know your space, don't be too loud. It's not about you as a person, it's about us as a people. And they work really hard. The students often spend nights in the lab. That is something I have not seen before, not even here. And I learned the value of cross-cultural intelligence because I realized that when I was in Japan, I was depicting American culture, at least for the first 3 days. That being boisterous, always giving my opinion. When a question is asked, I know the answer, I want to answer it. I had ideas I wanted to share. In the Japanese culture, success is expected. You're expected to get an A. It is when you don't that you get feedback. So nobody's going to pat my back for giving a good presentation. It's just not going to happen, right? So it was a learning experience. I spent a month in the lab, had the most amazing food and traveled the different prefectures, saw the very tall, historical bamboo trees and all of that. But that culture taught me the critical lesson I learned from Japan is cross-cultural intelligence, and the fact that I have been in America long enough to be depicting American culture when I go to other countries.
Wow. So there's a bit of a reimagining, not how you see your depiction, but also how others see the culture that you're depicting in your actions, your words, and even how you imagine yourself in a space.
Very much so. In this case, yes.
Wow. Wow. What would you say is perhaps some of the impact on your career that these different reimaginings and these experiences have allowed you to be able to identify?
When I started out my master's, like following my initial identity crisis as an undergrad, I was trained to be a food safety microbiologist, so very much a bench scientist. Halfway through, so the first half of my PhD was computational modeling, so I spent 90% in front of my computer. By the time I was going through the second half, some realities had come to give based on those experiences. I realized that I love people and I want people to love me back. I really enjoy human connection, understanding people, what drives them, what keeps them up at night, what their star out there in the world is about, what they aspire for. I know these seem like trivial things, but these are the things that drive human civilization into the future. The wars, the conflicts, the hunger, the pain, all of these things are driven by first individual desires, and then how those things group up into group identities. We are in groups because we identify with people in those groups. So the second half of my PhD, I completely pivoted out of the bench computation side into working in extension, because I wanted to find a way to apply the science and all this knowledge that I had accrued over 14 years of studying and reading and experimenting. And I always asked myself, why should a hungry 5-year-old boy care about my science? What's in it for them? Why should they listen when I speak? When Dr. Fauci stands in front of the TV and he gives ideas, why should a hungry baby care what he's thinking about, what he has to say? So it has really taught me to care about people and what drives them and what's important to them, the essence of who we are as human beings, and how science can make that better. I never enjoy when science is managing over people, hovering over people. And I know that a lot of people hate scientists, or dislike, I guess is a better word, because we seem to care so much about our work in the lab and our publications and our grants. And oftentimes we lose track of what people care about. COVID is an amazing example where scientists failed miserably. There was a big disconnect between what was happening with people in their suffering and their struggling to understand, and what scientists and regulators were doing. In food science and food safety, it's always been that way. There's a disconnect. So that's what all of these experiences have done for me. It's made me more in touch with humanity, and in many ways shaped my career and what I'm hoping to do in the future.
Wow. Wow. Were there ever, I mean, you don't have to cite a specific example, but were there ever any points where you said, I can recognize that this person or this group of people are doing that, and that's different than my culture? I will never do that. And then at some point you're like, oh my God, I'm doing that. You find yourself, you find yourself doing what you said you would never do.
Oh yeah, I will give you a very simple example because I was laughing about it yesterday. The first time I had breakfast at my school when I went to undergrad, there were bagels. I mean, they have the buffet for students and there's toast and scrambled eggs, whatever, and then they had bagels. And I looked at it and I thought, well, that's interesting. It looks like a funny looking mandazi to me. If you don't know what a mandazi is, just type it. It sounds exactly how you type it, exactly how it sounds. And I bit into it and it was this chewy, hard thing. And I told myself, I'm never going to eat this again. This is gross. Yesterday, I was eating bagels and I had a whole bag and I ate 2 of them out of the bag. So it's those little things where it doesn't have to be grand. Like I will never believe this or religious beliefs. No, for me, it's the nuances, the little things that are so American. Like I'll find myself singing the national anthem in the shower for no reason at all. Like I love the words of the American national anthem. To me are just so meaningful. They have deep meaning if you really listen and read and imagine what the people that wrote them were thinking about. So I'll find myself singing the national anthem in the shower. And then I think perhaps I should sing the Kenyan too, just to, put everything back in equilibrium. So nothing major, no change in religion or any of that. Just little things that have changed for me.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, I'm not Canadian and I've never really lived in Canada, but I've been there a lot. And I happen to know the Canadian national anthem by heart, as well as the American national anthem. And I don't know why sometimes I find myself like, do I remember the words? And in my head, I'm singing the Canadian national anthem. And then there's a side of me that's like, why am I doing that? Crazy. Sometimes you worry if certain things are adding to your culture, or are they stripping away some of your culture? When it's almost like, is it diluting it, or is it adding to it? The whole concept of the I like the Canadian versus the American. The Canadian version is the salad bowl. When you bring multiple cultures together, they're unique entities within the salad bowl. But in the United States, it's more of a soup. The idea that it becomes like assimilated into one, and it kind of, you can't necessarily identify each individual part of those cultures. It must be something that, as a scientist and as someone who has now been in a position where you're looking at it, like through the looking glass and through the other side of the looking glass, to observe this from a different perspective. What I'd like to do is I'd like to ask students if there's any questions they have, and then maybe have an opportunity for you for some final thoughts, maybe some takeaways. But let's go ahead and open up to the students what questions they may have for you before we kind of get to what are some of your biggest takeaways in terms of this kind of cultural reimagining adjustment. So any student questions? I think I saw someone on mute.
Yeah, so I have a question.
Katie.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. So I want to go back to something you said from your recent trip to Kenya about the idea of the people you were speaking to and kind of teaching how they could see themselves and their daughters in you. And, it wasn't like, an American or a Westerner standing in front of them trying to like transplant their own ideas or ideologies onto them. I feel like that's a really important point. And I, as someone who's really interested in working in sub-Saharan Africa, and at some point in my career, I want to be really cognizant and aware of being sensitive to that, and trying to avoid this idea of like, my ideas are better than yours, white saviorism. So what would you say that someone who's in that position could do to kind of support the idea of what you were saying, the ability of the people who you're trying to help not feeling like something is being imposed on them?
Thanks, Katie. One of the things that comes to my mind right off the bat is what our director of global initiatives did, which is, can you find somebody who knows this culture and is a part of this culture to work with you? They don't have to be the majority owner of whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish, but it goes a long way to have somebody there who looks like the population that you're trying to reach. I think it's meaningful for them to be able to hold on to something the first 50 seconds when you show up. Before you even start speaking, they look at the training team or the visiting team, and they can immediately latch onto something. Once you have their attention, then you can go on with whatever programming. The second thing, assuming that it's not possible to have somebody on the team from the culture, is making the time to understand the culture into which you're trying to go and really focus on what strengths do they already have in that culture in relation to what it is you're trying to do. So for example, the approach that I took with food safety training was not the microbiology approach, which is these are microbes, these are E. coli, this is the characteristic of E. coli. I could have done that because I am trained as a university trainer. The approach I took was using pictures and showing them, and these were not pictures that I brought from here. These were pictures of them doing their thing, them in the farm, them in the market, pictures of the local markets, local situations. So when I put up the picture and I asked them, do you recognize this? And it was kind of funny watching them trying to identify which market. Some of them actually figured out which market it was. But the question was, do you see anything interesting about this? Before I even talked about why I was there and my microbiology. And immediately you can hear them say, that lady needs to have better coverage over her vegetables. Or they would say, that person's vegetable stand is really dirty. They need to do a better job cleaning. So really appreciating the native knowledge and what they already know in relation to what you're trying to do helps them feel appreciated. So then you can use your expertise to build and empower rather than trying to impose, which is how your intent might not be to impose, but that is how it is perceived when you're a foreigner. And I know this because we have had so many NGOs come to our local setting trying to have water pumps and trying to vaccinate and trying to build clinics and hospitals. It always feels like they bring what works in the Western world and they want us to adopt it. Nobody ever asks us what we think, what would work best. Sometimes it's not the clinic that would be best for us. Sometimes it's counseling. Sometimes it's door-to-door conversations with the mothers. Sometimes it is talking to the men to give women permission to be able to adopt some of these new technologies, because there's this assumption that you'll just come in and you'll talk to whoever comes to the bazaar. Oftentimes you'll find that men will attend those group meetings, but they're not the ones involved in doing whatever it is you want done. Sometimes it's the women, especially when it comes to agriculture and feeding the family. So understanding that culture very well goes a long way. And one way to do that is to collaborate with somebody who's from that culture. They'll save you the time and the resources.
Wow, very powerful. Very
Thank you so much.
Other questions? Well, why don't we do this? Because we're also well into the hour here. What would be, I don't know if you have a number, so I don't want to say 3, but what would be some of your takeaways in terms of if you kind of alluded to it, that idea of working with someone who has a better understanding or experience within a culture. What would be some other takeaways or key tips, I guess, in terms of working into a multinational, multicultural scenario, leaving one's culture to work within another culture? What would be some of your points you would want to leave?
I do have 3 points, so you're in luck. And in this case, I'll speak about international engagements, and this might be a study abroad or internships or actual work or travel. Anytime that you're leaving your comfort zone and you're going into a place that has multiple cultures different from your own, whether that's in a different state or literally abroad in a different country, those engagements rarely happen by accident, especially in relation to work. It requires pre-work, what comes before. In my case, I have shared with you examples of collaborating, communicating, engaging with people ahead of time. That relationship building makes your visit meaningful and situational and in context. You can always go and be a tourist, but I don't think that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about going to a different country with a very particular purpose. Before you pack your bags and go to Peru or go to Zimbabwe, it might be helpful to know somebody who either works in Zimbabwe or lives in Zimbabwe, understand the context, have some engagements, some pre-work, that transition becomes easier if you already have that done ahead of time, rather than showing up at the airport, living in a hotel in the city, and then having to learn who's the chairman of the church, or who's the local, sheriff of the area I'm going to work in. Some of this you can get done ahead of time if you have somebody who's already there, who has worked there before. It can save you some of that headache. The other thing I've said before, but I'll reiterate because to me it really is critical, is that cross-cultural intelligence. It goes a really, really long way. There are some mistakes that we make when we visit different countries or different contexts that we should really not make in today's world where we have internet and we can read about a lot of things. A very good example I shared before is if you go to Kenya and you call a meeting, that meeting will be a meeting of men. And if you're talking about breastfeeding or cooking or agriculture, all of that work done by women. So the men will come and they'll listen, and then they'll go have a beer, and none of that information will ever get to the women. And even if it does, doesn't mean that the women have permission to do it. It doesn't mean the women have land rights to do it, because land is passed through the male, not the female in the generations. So understanding the culture, not just having connections there, but understanding how the cultures function. If you're going to an area that is highly Islamic, understanding that you should have your hair covered, how you speak, how you interact with the men, how you interact with the women, it really, really saves you the embarrassment or the waste of time, because sometimes they'll be kind and they'll listen to you because you're a foreigner. And then all of that work goes out the window when you leave, because there's no ownership. You really did not connect culturally with anyone that's willing to take ownership of your project. And then the final thing I'd say is these international engagements demand and require that you continue to be an open-minded, lifelong learner. When you only live in your country or your culture, as they say, you think your way is the best way. You think your way is the only way. And sometimes perhaps you expose yourself to other cultures by watching YouTube or watching, The Lion King. I have had so many ridiculous stereotypes since I came to the US about Africa and its people. I had people ask me if I have a pet lion. Do we have toilets that flush? Do we have cities? Do we have supermarkets? I know that level of ignorance is less and less over time, but the fact that people actually still think like that really surprises me. So what are those stereotypes that you have in your mind about where you're going? I'll give an example. In 2018, my husband got a job transfer from Minneapolis to the Czech Republic. And we were excited at the idea of going to Europe, but then we had a panic. Will he have the local food to eat? Will he have access to this? So we had a whole suitcase of things that were so ridiculous looking back. And we had so many preconceived notions about Eastern Europe, but the only thing we knew about Eastern Europe was based on what history had told us, right? And when we got there and we went to the supermarket, the money we had spent shipping this suitcase through the airlines would have been enough to purchase everything we needed because it was all there. And we spent a whole hour laughing at ourselves about this, and we really still do, because it was ridiculous. So I always like to ask people, which country are you going to? And what preconceived notions do you have? Can you spend some time to debunk some of those myths for yourself so that you don't look absolutely absurd when you show up and you find, oh my God, there are cities in Africa. There are rich people beyond your imagination that live in Africa, or South America, or the Indian subcontinent. Everywhere in the world is exactly the same as America. There are uber rich people, they're the rich people, they're the middle class, lower class, and poor people. It's the same everywhere. The only difference between us is our cultural nuances. And if we can learn that, I think we can succeed just about anywhere. I came from literally a village in Kenya when I was 18 years old. And now I'm here because apparently my opinion is, worth the salt right now to be able to share with a group of people who are professionals working internationally. It just requires a lot of learning and being open-minded and laughing at yourself when you make mistakes. Don't take yourself too seriously. It happens to everyone.
Well, Dr. Morrine Omolo, excuse me, it sounds to me as if there are multiple opportunities and increasing numbers of opportunities for how we can not only learn, not only how to prepare ourselves for travel to other places, to work successfully and to be impactful in what we're doing and successful in what we're doing in other locations. But also, I couldn't help but thinking about the idea of empathy, the idea that if we are inquisitive and genuine in how we're going about and trying to approach the work that we do across cultures, across political lines, and across large bodies of water, even that idea of it's not just about, and no offense, it's not just about did we bring the right things, could we have bought them there, did we really bring the right tools and the right mentality and the right empathy and the right mask, if you will, going back to that comment, in terms of what we need to have with us to do that work. And I'm sure that the people you interacted with learn from you, as well as I'm sure that the people that travel with you to Kenya learned a valuable lesson in terms of the masks that you were putting on there. I want to thank you. It's hard to capture in advance everything that you think you're going to be able to talk about. And I think that we learned a lot more than I had even imagined with this conversation. Thank you very much. And I know that you're looking at the idea of the career you had ahead of you, and that you're looking at potentially leaving where you are and even going to other states. I realize that even going to another state is going to be a completely different cultural experience, depending on where you go, and that there's lessons to be learned all around. So for all of the students who join us here, and for those who will be watching us on a recording of this, thank you very, very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop recording.